Never lose your composure again. Most people don't lose control once. They lose it in small moments every day. A reaction, a raised voice, a rushed decision. Composure is not personality. It's training. Think about the last week, not the dramatic moments, the ordinary ones. The email that produced an immediate, sharp reply before you had actually thought about whether that reply served you. The conversation that escalated faster than you intended, that ended in a place neither party wanted, driven by a tone that your own voice had set. The decision made under pressure that you would have made differently with 2 more hours and a clearer head. The small, private moments of frustration that flickered through your day, too brief to be dramatic, too frequent to be accidental. These are not failures of character. They are not evidence that you are particularly reactive or emotionally unsteady. They are evidence of what every human being faces in the absence of specific training and emotional system that was built for speed and that operates, in most moments, without the deliberate oversight that would produce different behavior. The emotional system does not wait for your permission. It reads the environment, generates a response, and prepares the body and the mind for action all before the deliberate part of you has had a chance to weigh in. This is efficient. It is sometimes life-saving. And in the conditions of ordinary modern life, it is the source of the specific, repeated, costly losses of composure that most people experience as simply who they are. They are not who you are. They are what you have not yet trained. This audiobook is the training, not a collection of tips for seeming calmer, not a motivational argument for why composure matters. The actual mechanics of how composure is built, how the emotional trigger loop is interrupted, how stress thresholds are expanded, how the Myropause technique changes the outcome of the moments that previously went sideways, and how, with consistent practice across ordinary days, composure stops being something you reach for and becomes something you inhabit. 10 chapters, 5 parts, 1 complete transformation. From reactive to deliberate. Begin. Introduction. Why composure is the most underbuilt skill. Composure is one of those qualities that almost everyone values and almost no one has deliberately built. It is valued because its effects are visible and significant. The person who can navigate a difficult conversation without raising their voice, make a clear decision under pressure without the quality of their thinking collapsing, receive criticism without either collapsing into defensiveness or becoming cold and withdrawn. This person is operating with a consistent advantage across every domain where other people are also involved. Professionally, relationally, personally, the quality of their responses in the moments that test everyone is what separates the outcomes they achieve from the outcomes available to people with equivalent capability but less composure. It is underbuilt because it is treated as a given rather than a developed capacity. People are described as naturally calm or naturally reactive, as though composure were distributed like height, something you have or you don't. In the amount you were given, the person who is reactive in difficult moments tends to attribute the reactivity to their personality, their history, their temperament, and this attribution, however understandable, closes off the possibility of change before any attempt at it has been made. Composure is a skill. It is learnable in the same sense that any skill is learnable through the understanding of the mechanism, the identification of the specific capacities that need to be developed. the consistent practice of those capacities and conditions that build them, and the gradual accumulation of evidence that the practice is working, evidence that changes the self unept and reinforces the continued practice. The mechanism of composure is not complex, though it operates below the level of conscious awareness in most people most of the time. Something happens, a trigger, external or internal, that activates the emotional system. The activation produces a state that has specific characteristics, a narrowing of the range of available responses, an acceleration of the drive toward action, a reduction in access to the deliberate thinking that would produce better considered responses. The composure skill is the capacity to interrupt this sequence, not to prevent the activation, but to maintain enough access to deliberate processing between the activation and the action that genuine choice remains in the process. This audiobook builds that capacity systematically. Part 1 examines why composure fails, the mechanics of the trigger loop, and the specific ways that accumulated stress degrades the capacity for composed response before any individual triggering event has occurred. Part 2 builds the foundational practices, the early recognition of emotional escalation that creates the window for intervention, and the Miropause technique that is the most direct and immediately available tool for changing the outcome of the moments that previously went wrong. Parts 3 and 4 apply the architecture to the real conditions that test at most: conflict, sustained pressure, recovery after emotional activation, and the long-term training of the resilience that makes composure available even when conditions are difficult. And Part 5 completes the transformation from someone who practices composure in difficult moments to someone for whom composure is the default and natural expression of an identity built through consistent, honest, sustained practice. Every tool you need is in the chapters ahead. The first step is understanding what you are working with. Part I. Why people lose composure. You cannot interrupt a mechanism you do not understand. Part 1 maps the mechanism, the specific ways that the emotional system produces the reactive behavior that composure training works to change. Chapter 1 examines the trigger loop, how emotional reactions develop into automatic patterns that operate faster than deliberate thought. Chapter 2 examines the role of accumulated stress, how composure is not lost only in the dramatic moments, but erodes steadily under the weight of conditions that precede those moments. Understanding the mechanism does not change the behavior, but it changes the accuracy of the diagnosis. An accurate diagnosis is the prerequisite for effective intervention. Chapter 1. The emotional trigger loop. Your reactions follow patterns. This is the first and most important thing to understand about reactive behavior. It is not random. The moments when you lose composure, when the response comes out sharper than you intended, when the frustration spills over in a way you later regret, when the decision made in a heated moment turns out to be the wrong one, are not isolated incidents produced by chance combinations of circumstances. They follow predictable patterns, specific types of situations, specific kinds of comments, specific combinations of pressure and prior state produce specific responses with a reliability that, once recognized, becomes the first clear opening for change. The emotional trigger is the event or perception that initiates a reactive sequence. It is called a trigger because it fires the sequence activating the emotional response before the deliberate mind has had any involvement in the process. Triggers are not inherently problematic. They are the normal mechanism through which the emotional system responds to the environment. The problem arises when the trigger-to-reaction sequence runs so quickly and so completely that no deliberate processing occurs between them when the reaction simply happens, in the form and at the intensity the emotional system specified, without any genuine choice about whether this response serves the situation. How do triggers develop? They are learned. Every instance of a specific type of situation producing a specific emotional response reinforces the association between them. The first time a comment that felt dismissive produced a defensive reaction, the association between this type of comment and this type of response was weakly formed. The 100th time, the association is strong enough that the response begins to precede the conscious recognition of what has been said. The trigger activates, the pattern fires, the reaction occurs, and the deliberate mind arrives to find a response already in progress that it had no role in producing. Emotional memory is the mechanism through which triggers develop their power. The brain does not store all memories equally. Emotionally significant experiences that occurred in states of high activation are encoded more strongly than neutral experiences. This encoding serves an adaptive purpose. Events that were emotionally significant were often events that had survival relevance. And stronger encoding means faster access the next time a similar situation is encountered. The system learns from emotional experience more rapidly and more durably than from neutral experience. The consequence for trigger development is that a relatively small number of emotionally significant experiences can establish strong trigger response associations that then persist and generalize. A handful of instances where a specific type of situation produced strong emotional activation can create an association that is activated by situations that are only superficially similar to the original ones. The trigger has generalized. It is no longer responding only to the specific situation that originally produced the emotion, but to a broader category of situations that share its surface features. This generalization is efficient but imprecise. The association formed in one context fires in contexts that are similar in appearance but genuinely different in their implications and in what the appropriate response would be. The emotional memory is treating the new situation as though it were the old one, and the old response calibrated to a different situation is produced in a context it may not fit. Automatic reactions are the behavioral output of the trigger loop operating at full speed, the response that occurs without deliberate mediation, produced by the emotional system's pattern-matched response to the recognized trigger. What makes automatic reactions so difficult to address is exactly what makes them automatic. They are fast. The trigger activates, the emotional state is generated, the behavioral impulse is produced, all within a time frame that precedes the deliberate mind's access to the situation. By the time conscious awareness registers what has happened, the reaction is often already in motion. The voice has already taken a tone. The words are already being said. The message is already being typed. The decision is already being executed. The usual strategies for managing this: trying harder to control yourself, making resolutions about future behavior, criticizing the reaction after the fact, do not address the mechanism. They operate at the level of intent, while the problem operates at the level of automatic process. Trying harder to not react does not interrupt the trigger loop. It adds a layer of intention on top of a pattern that is faster and more automatic than the intention can address. What does interrupt the trigger loop is something more structural, the development of the specific capacities that insert deliberate processing into the sequence between trigger and response. Not by slowing the trigger, the emotional system is what it is. By building the habit of the pause, the early recognition of the escalation beginning, and the practiced return to deliberate access that are the specific tools of composure training. These tools are described in detail in Part 2. Before they can be applied effectively, however, there is a second mechanism of composure failure that must be understood, one that operates not at the level of individual trigger events, but at the level of accumulated state. This mechanism is what Chapter 2 addresses. Understanding it changes the scope of what composure training requires. Chapter 2: Stress and Emotional Overload. Composure collapses when stress accumulates. The trigger loop described in Chapter 1 explains the mechanism of individual reactive events, how specific triggers produce automatic reactions through the emotional memory associations that have been built over time. But it does not fully explain the variability that most people notice in their own composure, the fact that the same type of trigger produces very different responses on different days, under different conditions at different points in a day or a week. The same comment from the same person that passes without difficulty on a Tuesday morning can produce a disproportionate response on a Thursday afternoon. The challenge that is handled with equanimity after a good night of sleep becomes genuinely difficult to manage after several nights of poor sleep and a week of continuous demands. The trigger has not changed. What has changed is the state of the system receiving it. This state dependence of composure is one of the most practically important things to understand about managing it. Composure is not uniformly available across all conditions. It is highest when the regulatory system is well rescued and lowest when that system is depleted. And the depletion is not produced only by large stressors. It is produced steadily, quietly, cumulatively by the ordinary demands of modern daily life. Stress thresholds are the conceptual framework for understanding this depletion. Every person has a threshold above which the emotional regulation system begins to fail, where the resources available for composed response are insufficient to meet the demands being made on them. Below the threshold, triggers can be received and managed with the full suite of regulatory capacities available. Above the threshold, the same triggers produce responses that the full recursive system would have managed differently. The threshold is not a fixed point. It varies with sleep, with nutrition, with the accumulated weight of unresolved demands, with the quality of recovery time between demanding periods. A person whose threshold is high because they are well rested, reasonably recovered, and not carrying a large background load of unprocessed stress has a significant buffer before the reactive zone is reached. A person whose threshold has been lowered by the gradual accumulation of the opposite conditions, poor sleep, inadequate recovery, continuous demand without adequate rest, enters every interaction already closer to the reactive zone, with less buffer available before even minor triggers produce disproportionate responses. This is why composure training cannot focus exclusively on the management of individual trigger events. The trigger is only part of the story. The state of the system when the trigger arrives is equally important, and often more so. Cognitive overload is a specific form of the threshold challenge that deserves particular attention because of how it affects the specific capacity that composure most requires. Composed response to a trigger requires deliberate processing, the ability to pause the automatic sequence and access the more considered response that the situation actually warrants. Deliberate processing is not free. It consumes a cognitive resource that is finite and state-dependent. Under conditions of low cognitive load, this resource is available and the deliberate processing can do its work. Under conditions of cognitive overload, too many demands competing for processing resources. Working memory full, the deliberate processing system already near capacity, the resource for composed response is diminished precisely when it is being asked to perform. The person managing a difficult conversation, while already cognitively overloaded, is attempting composed response with significantly less deliberate processing available than the same person would have under lower cognitive load. The words come out shorter, sharper, less carefully chosen. Not because they have chosen to be less careful, but because the system that would produce more careful responses is already deployed elsewhere. Emotional fatigue completes the picture of why composure fails under accumulated stress. Emotional fatigue is the specific depletion of the regulatory resource produced by sustained emotional effort, the effort of managing strong emotional states, of holding composure in demanding social situations, of processing the continuous flow of emotionally significant information that modern life produces. The person in emotional fatigue does not experience the world as more threatening or more difficult than usual. They experience their own responses as harder to regulate, as requiring more effort per response than they normally would, as exceeding their available regulatory capacity more frequently, as producing a kind of rawness in their reactions that is recognizable as different from their baseline. Identifying emotional fatigue early before it has produced the specific reactive behavior that damages relationships and decisions is one of the most valuable early warning practices in composure training. The signs are specific impatience arriving faster than usual, small frustrations carrying more weight than they normally would, the sense of being less able to let things go, the slightly shortened fuse that is not the full loss of composure, but is the warning that the full loss is closer than it should be. When you notice these signs, and Part 2 will build the awareness practices needed to notice them earlier, you have information, not about the specific trigger in front of you, but about the state of the system receiving it. And information about the state of the system is directly actionable. It tells you to apply the miropause with more deliberateness, to lower the conversational stakes where possible, to avoid high-demand decisions if they can wait, and to prioritize the recovery practices that Part 4 describes. The person who understands their stress threshold and manages their approach to situations based on where they currently or relative to it is doing something more sophisticated than willpower-based composure management. They are working with the system rather than against it. That working wedge is what makes composure sustainable rather than occasional. Part A. Building internal control. Understanding why composure fails is necessary but not sufficient. Part 2 builds the first two practical layers of the composure architecture: the awareness capacity that catches escalation early enough for intervention, and the miropause technique that is the most direct behavioral tool for changing the outcome of triggered moments. These two capacities work together. Awareness creates the window. The pause uses it. Neither is effective without the other. Chapter 3. Recognizing triggers early. Awareness interrupts reactions. The trigger loop described in Chapter 1 operates through a sequence trigger. Emotional activation, behavioral impulse, reaction. The speed of this sequence is what makes it feel unavoidable by the time awareness arrives. The reaction is often already in progress. The natural response to this experience is to feel that composure was never available in that moment, that the reaction simply happened faster than any intervention could have prevented it. This feeling is accurate about late awareness. Awareness that arrives after the reaction has already begun is too late to change that reaction, though it can inform the next one. What changes the calculus entirely is early awareness that arrives before the escalation has reached the point where the deliberate mind's access is significantly impaired. The emotional escalation from trigger to full reactive state is not instantaneous. It is a process that takes time, even when that time is measured in seconds rather than minutes. During this process, there is a window, brief but real, during which the escalation is beginning but has not yet reached its peak, during which the deliberate mind still has partial access, during which an intervention can redirect the sequence toward a different outcome. Catching escalation in this window requires awareness of the early signals that the escalation is beginning, not the full feeling by the time the full feeling has arrived. The window has often already closed. The precursors to the full feeling, the specific physical sensations that tend to appear before the emotional state reaches its peak. Early emotional signals are the body's first communications that an activation is beginning. They vary between individuals and between emotional states, but they have common features. They are physical. They arrive before the emotional state reaches full intensity, and they are below the threshold of habitual attention in most people because awareness has not been trained to look for them at that level of subtlety. For frustration, common early signals include a subtle tightening in the jaw or the shoulders, a slight shortening of the breath, a quality of resistance in the body's engagement with the current moment. For anxiety, the early signals often include a subtle acceleration in the pace of thought, a vague forward orientation of attention toward anticipated future problems, a slight hollowness in the chest. For anger, early signals might include a rising warmth in the face or neck, a sense of heightened physical alertness, the specific quality of attention that is beginning to focus exclusively on the triggering element rather than on the broader context. These descriptions are approximate and individual. The task is not to match your experience to a general list, but to develop, through deliberate attention and awareness of your own specific early signals, what your particular version of the beginning of frustration or anxiety or anger feels like in the body, before it has reached the intensity at which it becomes unmistakable. Developing this awareness is the work of observation in low-stakes moments, noticing, in ordinary daily interactions, the early physical signals that accompany the beginnings of emotional activation, and building the habit of attending to that level of subtlety. This observation builds the recognition capacity that will operate automatically in higher stakes moments, flagging the early signal before the deliberate mind would otherwise have noticed anything was beginning. Recognizing escalation is the next level of awareness, not just the early signal of a single activation, but the pattern of how that activation typically builds toward its peak. Escalation has a structure. It follows a trajectory that, once recognized, becomes predictable in real time. The early signal arrives. If the trigger is not removed and no intervention occurs, the activation intensifies. The range of available responses narrows as the intensity increases. The deliberate mind's access decreases progressively with each increment of intensity. The physical signals become more pronounced. The thought content becomes increasingly focused on the triggering element and decreasingly available for the broader perspective that would produce a composed response. Recognizing this trajectory as it is occurring, not just the early signal, but the direction of movement, the rate of escalation, how far along the trajectory the current moment represents, is a more sophisticated awareness than simply noticing the early signal. It provides information that is directly relevant to the urgency of intervention. A slow, early escalation offers more time for the pause. A fast, later-stage escalation requires more immediate and more deliberate application of the pause technique. Slowing emotional momentum is the first direct application of early awareness, using the recognition of the escalation to apply a specific intervention before the trajectory has reached the point where intervention is significantly harder. The momentum of emotional escalation is real and specific once the activation is underway. It has a forward motion that carries it toward its peak unless something interrupts that motion. The interruption does not need to be dramatic. It can be as simple as a deliberate change in the breath pattern, which provides the backward physiological channel into the activation described in earlier chapters of this audiobook series. It can be a deliberate shift in physical position, which changes the body's activation pattern in ways that slightly reduce the momentum. It can be the deliberate, specific naming of the emotional state that is beginning, not the narrative that surrounds it, but the simple internal acknowledgement this is frustration beginning. Each of these is small. Each is specifically targeted at the momentum of the escalation rather than at the suppression of the emotion. The goal is not to prevent the feeling, but to slow its trajectory to buy enough time for the deliberate mind to remain available for the micropause that Chapter 4 describes. Early recognition creates the window. What fills the window is the next chapter. Chapter 4. The micropause technique. A few seconds can change outcomes. The micropause is the most direct, immediately available, and practically powerful tool in the Composure architecture. It is not a complex technique. Its simplicity is part of what makes it powerful. It is available in any moment. Requires no equipment, no preparation, and no external support. The only requirement is the trained capacity to apply it in the moments when the pull toward the automatic reaction is strongest. The micropause is exactly what it sounds like: a deliberate, brief pause between the trigger activation and the behavioral response. Not a long pause, not an extended period of reflection or analysis. A few seconds, or at most a few tens of seconds, a carefully held space in which the deliberate mind has the opportunity to participate in what happens next rather than finding the reaction already in progress when it arrives. Why does such a brief pause produce the outcomes that it does? The answer lies in the neurological dynamics of the activation window described in Chapter 3. The peak of emotional activation, the point of maximum reactivity, minimum deliberate access, and greatest narrowing of the available response range lasts a finite time and then begins to diminish as the neurochemical cascade that produced it is metabolized. Even a few seconds into the peak, the intensity is beginning to reduce slightly. The deliberate mind's access is beginning to recover slightly. The range of possible responses is beginning to widen slightly. Slightly is enough. The difference between the response produced at the absolute peak and the response produced even a few seconds into the decay of the peak can be significant. Not always dramatic, the fully considered response of a calm state is not available at the 3-second point in a myropause. But the worst excesses of the peak state response, the sharpness that exceeds what was intended, the escalation that produces a worse outcome than a different response would have, the irreversible commitment to a course of action that better considered judgment would have declined, these are often avoided. Delaying the reaction is the first dimension of the myropause, and it is the one that requires the most direct practice because it requires acting in opposition to the strongest pull of the activated state. The pull of the reactive state is toward action, toward expression, toward the behavioral discharge of the activation in whatever form the pattern specifies, the sharp reply, the escalating voice, the impulsive decision, the body language that communicates the internal state directly and without filter. This pull is physiological as well as psychological. It feels necessary. It feels like the response the situation demands. The idea of delaying it, of not doing the thing the state is pushing toward, produces its own discomfort. The discomfort of containing something that is pressing for release. Tolerating this discomfort for a few seconds is the core of the myropause practice. It is not the tolerance of suppression, the active holding down of an emotion against its will, which depletes and eventually fails. It is the tolerance of delay, the explicit, temporary decision to not execute the behavioral impulse immediately, while the neurochemical peak diminishes slightly and the deliberate mind recovers access. The distinction between suppression and delay is important. Suppression says this emotion must not exist. Delay says this emotion is real and present, and I am choosing not to express it in the next 3 seconds. Suppression depletes and accumulates. Delay is a specific, finite act that changes the outcome of the moment without pretending the emotional content is not there. Resetting breathing during the myropause is the physiological component of the technique, and it is both the most practically accessible and the most immediately effective physical tool available. The breath is the one physiological process that is both automatic and subject to voluntary control. Every other physiological feature of the emotional activation, the elevated heart rate, the increased cortisol, the muscular readiness for action, cannot be directly changed by a conscious decision. The breath can, and because the nervous system uses breath pattern as information about the organism's state, slow, extended exhalation being associated with the regulated, safe state, deliberately changing the breath pattern provides a backward channel into the physiological activation itself. During the myropause, the specific breathing technique is a deliberate, extended exhalation longer than the inhalation, repeated 2 to 3 times. This pattern activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which counteracts the sympathetic activation of the stress response. The result is not a return to full calm. 3 breath cycles in a few seconds are not sufficient for that. The result is a partial reduction in the intensity of the activation, a slight slowing of the heart rate, and a slight increase in access to the deliberate processing that the pause is intended to use. This partial reduction is the point. It does not need to be complete to be useful. The slightly reduced activation, combined with the delay of the behavioral impulse, creates conditions in which the quality of the response that follows is genuinely better than the quality of the response that the peak state would have produced. Regaining cognitive control is what becomes possible once the delay and the breathing reset have created the brief space of the myropause. Cognitive control in this context does not mean the full analytical processing of a calm, undistorted state. It means the restoration of enough deliberate access to ask a single guiding question before the response is produced. What does this moment actually require? That question is the bridge between the automatic reaction and the chosen response. The automatic reaction is what the emotional system specified in the absence of deliberate input. The chosen response is what the deliberate mind produces when it has had even a few seconds to participate. The guiding question focuses the deliberate input on the most relevant consideration, not what do I feel like doing, but what does this situation actually require of me? The answers to this question in the heat of a triggered moment are not always the wise, fully considered answers that a genuinely calm state would produce. But they are better than the absence of the question. They introduce a degree of perspective that the peak state response does not contain. And over hundreds of applications of the myropause technique, across the ordinary moments of daily life, this degree of perspective compounds into a genuinely different quality of habitual response. The technique changes the moment. Consistent application of the technique changes the person. Part A. Staying composed under pressure. The practice is built in part to early recognition, and the myropause are applied in the conditions of ordinary life in two primary forms: the social pressure of conflict and disagreement, and the sustained cognitive and emotional pressure of high-demand periods. Part 3 addresses both. Chapter 5 examines composure in conflict, the specific challenge of maintaining deliberate access when another person's emotional activation is directly engaging yours. Chapter 6 examines composure under workload and sustained stress, the management of the regulatory resource across extended difficult periods. Chapter 5. Handling conflict calmly. Arguments reward composure. This is not a moral claim, not an argument that you should be composed in conflict because composure is virtuous. It is a strategic observation in most conflicts. The person who maintains higher access to deliberate processing while the other person has lost theirs is the person who leads the outcome. Not always toward victory. Conflict outcomes are complex, but toward the resolution that their genuine interests require rather than toward the escalated exchange that nobody intended and that nobody benefits from. Conflict is the most direct test of composure precisely because it activates the emotional system through the social threat channel. Another person's challenge, criticism, or escalation is read by the emotional system as a threat to status, to self-image, or to the social relationship, and the defensive or aggressive response that the trigger loop generates in response is specifically tuned to meet this kind of threat. The impulse to defend, to counterattack, to demonstrate that you are not going to absorb the challenge without response. These are not irrational responses. They are the emotional system doing what it was built to do in response to social threat. The cost of following these impulses unchecked is the specific cost of conflict escalation, the exchange that becomes about defending positions rather than addressing the actual issue. The relationship damage from words said in activated states that wouldn't have been said otherwise. The outcomes determined by whoever had the more forceful emotional expression rather than by the actual quality of the positions involved. Emotional neutrality in disagreement is not the absence of position or passion. It is the maintenance of deliberate access, the capacity to hold your position, advocate for it clearly, and respond to the other person's position accurately, without the reactive escalation that converts a disagreement into a conflict and a conflict into a damage event. The practice of emotional neutrality in disagreement begins before the specific exchange. It begins with the framing of what the disagreement is. The person who enters a disagreement with the frame "this person is wrong and I need to prove it" has already oriented themselves toward the adversarial mode that makes escalation likely. The person who enters the same disagreement with the frame "we see this differently and I want to understand why" is positioned for a different quality of exchange, not one that automatically produces agreement, but one that maintains access to the information that disagreement contains rather than immediately foreclosing it through the pressure to prevail. During the exchange itself, the specific practice of emotional neutrality is the application of everything from part to early recognition of the activation beginning as the other person speaks. The miropause before responding rather than responding immediately to each point. The deliberate breath that reduces the physiological intensity of the activation. And the guiding question, what does this moment require, that focuses the response on the actual issue rather than on the defensive or offensive impulse. De-escalation strategies are the specific tools for managing conflict when the other person's activation is high and the reciprocal escalation pressure is correspondingly strong. The primary de-escalation tool is the deliberate refusal to match the other person's emotional register. Escalation in conflict is typically reciprocal. One person's elevated tone produces an elevated response, which drives the first person's tone higher, in the upward spiral that most unmanaged conflicts follow. The refusal to match the response delivered at a lower temperature than the statement it responds to interrupts this spiral at the point where your participation in it is located. This interruption is difficult because matching the other person's register feels, in the moment, like the appropriate response. If they are speaking with intensity, speaking without matching intensity feels like weakness or indifference. This feeling is inaccurate. The deliberate maintenance of a lower register is not weakness, it is the exercise of the specific capacity that the activated state cannot access. It is more difficult to do than matching, not less. The person who is genuinely calmer, who has genuinely maintained composure while the other person has escalated, is not in a weaker position. They are in a stronger one. The de-escalation effect of a consistently lower register is real and typically faster than expected. The nervous system synchronization mechanism through which the emotional states of people in close interaction tend toward partial alignment works in both directions. The calm voice provides a competing synchronization target for the other person's system. The escalation may continue briefly, but without the reciprocal matching that feeds it. It tends to peak and begin to reduce more quickly than it would if the escalation were being met symmetrically. Staying rational during conflict is the cognitive component of the composure practice, maintaining access to the actual content of what is being discussed rather than being entirely absorbed in the social threat management that high emotional activation produces. Rationality under conflict pressure is not a matter of suppressing emotion. It is a matter of maintaining enough deliberate access alongside the emotional experience to keep the substance of the conversation available. The specific practice is attention management, deliberately bringing the attention back to the actual question under discussion when it has been drawn away by the emotional pressure of how the discussion is being conducted. What did they actually say? Not what did their tongue communicate about their feeling toward me, but what is the content of their position? What is the actual disagreement here? What would I need to know? And what would they need to know for this to be resolved? These questions are simple. They are not easy to ask in a charged moment. But the practice of asking them even imperfectly, even one or two instead of all of them, maintains a thread of substantive engagement through the conflict that gives it somewhere productive to go. Conflicts that maintain substantive engagement resolve more often and more durably than conflicts that degenerate entirely into emotional management. The composure practice is not just better for the relationship, it is better for the outcome. Chapter 6. Maintaining control during stress. Pressure reveals training. Not character in the fixed sense, the idea that who you are under pressure is who you really are, as though pressure strips away performance to reveal a permanent truth. What pressure reveals is the current state of the training, which internal capacities have been practiced enough to run with reduced cognitive resource expenditure, and which ones still require more deliberate resource than the pressured state can supply. This reframe is important because it changes the meaning of composure failures under pressure. They are not revelations of a permanent deficit. They are data about the current training level, and training levels change with practice. Staying steady under workload is the specific challenge of maintaining composure when the cognitive load is high, when many things are competing for attention, when the working memory is full, when the system is being asked to perform at high demand across multiple simultaneous requirements. The composure challenge under high workload is that the deliberate processing resource needed for composed response is the same resource being consumed by the workload itself. The two demands are drawing from the same finite pool. When the workload is consuming most of the available deliberate processing capacity, there is genuinely less available for the composure management that the social and emotional dimensions of the work require. Managing this scarcity requires both the specific practices of the myropathus, which reduce the deliberate processing cost of composure by providing a more automated intervention pathway, and the workload management practices that reduce the unnecessary consumption of deliberate processing by the logistics of work. The workload management practices that most directly support composure are not primarily time management techniques in the conventional sense. They are cognitive load management practices, the deliberate reduction of the number of things being actively held in working memory simultaneously, through the external offloading of information that does not need to be internally held but is consuming internal processing space anyway. Everything that is sitting in your working memory as an open loop, an unresolved commitment, an unaddressed concern, an uncompleted task is consuming a small amount of the cognitive resource that would otherwise be available for the deliberate processing that composure requires. The accumulation of many open loops, even small ones, can produce a cognitive load that significantly impairs composure even in the absence of any individual high-demand task. The practice is systematic closure and external storage, completing the small things that take less time to do than to continue managing as open loops, writing down the things that need to be remembered or addressed rather than holding them internally, and creating enough clarity about priorities that the working memory is not continuously scanning across everything simultaneously to check whether the current activity is the most important one. Decision-making in stress is the specific executive function that is most visibly degraded by high emotional activation, and managing it under pressure requires specific practices beyond the general composure tools. The quality of decisions made under pressure degrades in predictable ways. The range of alternatives considered narrows. The time horizon for consequence evaluation shortens. The tendency toward default or familiar choices increases. The capacity for the integrative, creative thinking that genuinely difficult problems require is reduced. These degradations are not failures of intelligence, they are the predictable output of the deliberate processing system operating with reduced resource under high-stress state activation. The primary strategy for protecting decision quality under stress is temporal deferring high stakes, non-reversible decisions to periods of lower activation when possible. The decision that can wait for an hour until the immediate activation has reduced will typically be a better decision than the one made at the peak of the stressed state. This is not avoidance. It is the rational use of information about the current quality of the decision-making instrument. When deferral is not possible, when the decision must be made now. In this activated state, without the option of waiting, the Miropahos technique is applied to the decision itself rather than to a social interaction. The brief pause before committing, the deliberate breath, the single guiding question, what does this moment actually require? These do not produce the decision quality of a fully calm state. They produce the best decision quality available in the current state, which is meaningfully better than the decision produced by the peak activation without the pause. Avoiding emotional exhaustion is the long-term application of the workload and stress management practices, the proactive management of the regulatory resource across extended periods of high demand so that the cumulative depletion described in Chapter 2 does not reduce composure to levels where even minor triggers produce significant reactive responses. The practices that most directly prevent emotional exhaustion under sustained stress are the recovery practices that Part 4 will address in detail. What is worth noting here is that they must be proactive rather than reactive, applied before the depletion has reached the levels where composure failures are frequent, rather than as emergency interventions after the damage has already occurred. Proactive recovery is not luxury under sustained stress. It is the maintenance requirement of the system that composure depends on. Part of developing long-term composure. The short-term composure practices of Parts 2 and 3 address the moments of activation as they occur. But composure that is only available when you are actively applying specific techniques in difficult moments is not yet the deep composure that this audiobook aims to build. Part 4 addresses the two larger capacities that transform situational composure into sustained composure: the ability to recover effectively after emotional activation, and the deliberate training of emotional resilience that expands the capacity for composed response across the full range of conditions that life produces. Chapter 7: Emotional Recovery. Even composed people reset. This is worth stating clearly at the outset of this chapter because the aspiration for composure can produce an unrealistic standard that is itself corrosive. The idea that the goal is never to be significantly activated, that any strong emotional response represents a failure of composure training, that the truly composed person moves through life in a state of permanent equanimity undisturbed by difficulty. That person does not exist. Emotional activation in response to significant events is normal, appropriate, and in many cases necessary. It is the mechanism through which values and priorities assert themselves, through which important information about the situation is registered, through which the energy for significant action is generated. The absence of emotional activation is not composure. It is disengagement. What composure in the deepest sense means is not the prevention of activation, but the reliability of return, the consistent ability to come back to the regulated state from periods of genuine activation, without extended residence in the reactive zone, without the emotional carryover that makes subsequent activations more likely and more intense, and without the secondary layers of response to the activation itself, the frustration about having been frustrated, the self-criticism about having lost composure that often extend the activated period far beyond what the original trigger would have produced. Recovering after emotional spikes is the specific practice of return, the deliberate navigation from an activated state back toward the regulated baseline. The first principle of effective recovery is allowing the peak to pass without fighting it. The emotional activation has a natural arc. It rises to its peak, holds there for a finite time, and then begins to diminish as the neurochemical cascade is metabolized and the nervous system returns toward equilibrium. Fighting this arc, attempting to force the activation to end before it is ready, suppressing the feeling rather than allowing it to complete its natural course, does not accelerate the return to baseline. It often extends it, both by consuming regulatory resource in the suppression effort and by preventing the processing that allows the activation to genuinely resolve. Allowing the arc to complete does not mean acting from the peak state while it is present. The Myropoulos technique handles the behavioral management of the peak period. What it means is accepting the internal experience of the activation. The frustration is there. The anger is there. The anxiety is there without requiring it to be gone before it is ready to go. This acceptance shortens the peak. The absence of the fight against the feeling allows the feeling's own natural resolution process to proceed unimpeded. Mental decompression is the active practice of recovery, the specific activities and conditions that most efficiently return the regulatory system to its pre-activation baseline. Physical movement is among the most reliable decompression tools. For reasons already described in earlier chapters of this series, the physiological activation of the emotional state is preparation for physical response, and physical movement provides the natural outlet for that preparation, metabolizing the neurochemical state more efficiently than continued stillness. The nature and intensity of the movement matter less than its occurrence. A brief walk is sufficient. A period of physical activity that directs attention outward toward the environment, toward the physical experience rather than inward toward the continued processing of the activating content, is specifically effective because it interrupts the cognitive loop that tends to sustain activation beyond its natural peak. That cognitive loop, the replaying of the activating event, the continued processing of what was said and what should have been said, the forward projection into anticipated consequences, is one of the primary mechanisms through which activated states are prolonged beyond their natural duration. The activation itself would diminish within a relatively short time without the cognitive loop feeding it. The loop restimulates the activation with each cycle. sustaining the heightened state long past the point where the original event would have stopped producing it. Interrupting this loop is the specific recovery practice for the cognitively sustained activation. The interruption does not require convincing yourself that the activating event did not matter or that the feelings about it are unjustified. It requires directing attention elsewhere, not permanently, but for long enough that the loop loses momentum. The deliberate engagement of attention with something outside the current activated content, a task that requires genuine cognitive engagement. Physical movement, a conversation about a different subject, any activity that pulls attention away from the re-stimulating replay. Restoring balance is the endpoint of the recovery process, the return to the state in which the full range of regulated capacities is available. The threshold is restored to its pre-activation level, and the subsequent activation, whether from a new trigger or from the return of attention to the original activating event, meets a system with full regulatory resource rather than a depleted one. The time this takes varies with the intensity of the activation, the current state of the regulatory resource, and the effectiveness of the specific recovery practices applied. What matters for the composure architecture is not the speed of the return, but its reliability, the consistent capacity to complete the return rather than remaining in an extended, partially activated state that makes the next activation significantly more costly. Recovery is a skill. Like all skills, it improves with deliberate practice. Chapter 8. Training emotional resilience. Resilience is emotional stamina. Stamina in the physical sense is the capacity to sustain effort over time, to continue performing at an acceptable level, not just when fresh, but when the accumulated work of previous effort has produced fatigue. Emotional stamina is structurally analogous, the capacity to maintain composed response not just in isolated incidents, but across extended periods of demand. In the accumulation of many activating events, in the sustained conditions that test the regulatory system continuously rather than occasionally. This stamina is built the same way physical stamina is built, through progressive exposure to demands that slightly exceed the current comfortable capacity, with adequate recovery between demanding periods, allowing the system to adapt to each new level before the level is raised again. Increasing tolerance to stress is the first dimension of resilience building. And it is the most counterintuitive because it involves deliberate exposure to manageable difficulty rather than its avoidance. The regulatory system, like the muscular system, adapts to the demands placed on it. A person who consistently avoids situations that produce emotional activation is not building resilience. They are maintaining the current capacity level without developing additional capacity. The activation that has been avoided did not build anything. The activation that was encountered, managed with the available tools, and recovered from built something a slightly higher threshold, a slightly more practiced application of the management tools, a slightly greater confidence in the capacity for composed response. The deliberate choice to remain in mildly activating situations rather than exiting them prematurely, to have the difficult conversation rather than deferring it again, to receive the challenging feedback without the defensive exit, to stay in the uncomfortable moment rather than escaping into distraction, is the progressive loading that builds resilience, not the dramatization of difficulty. The voluntary engagement with the manageable difficulty that is present in ordinary life and that is normally avoided. This practice requires honest calibration. The loading must be manageable, not so far beyond the current capacity that it produces overwhelm rather than development. The person who deliberately throws themselves into situations that far exceed their current regulatory capacity is not building resilience. They are depleting the resource that resilience requires. Progressive means incremental, slightly beyond comfortable, not dramatically beyond available. Expanding emotional capacity is what happens over time with consistent progressive loading and adequate recovery, the genuine expansion of the amount of emotional demand the system can meet before the reactive zone is reached. This expansion is real and measurable, though it is gradual enough that it is rarely visible in day-to-day experience. What becomes visible over months of consistent practice is a changed relationship with the situations that previously produced reactive responses. Not their absence from the experience. The triggers are still present, but their reduced power. The comment that previously produced a strong reactive response now produces a mild activation that the available tools manage easily. The conflict that previously escalated to a damaging exchange now reaches its escalation point and levels off as the composure practice intercepts the momentum. The sustained pressure that previously produced emotional exhaustion within days now produces it within weeks, and with better recovery practices within months. These are changes in capacity. They are the product of training, and the training that produced them is available, in principle, to anyone who applies it consistently. Consistent practice is the final subchapter of this section, and it is where the aspirational frequently meets the ordinary difficulty of actually executing consistently. Consistency is the variable that most determines whether the composure training described in this audiobook produces the outcomes it describes. A person who applies the Miropoulos technique in the difficult moments and then returns to unexamined reactive behavior in the ordinary moments has not built much capacity. The occasional application produces occasional results without the cumulative adaptation that consistent practice generates. The consistency requirement does not mean perfect application in every moment. It means regular enough application that the practices become increasingly automatic, that the pause is taken more often than not, that the early recognition habit is active across the ordinary day rather than only in high-stakes situations, that the recovery practices are applied after activations rather than allowing the activated state to simply linger until the next activation compounds it. What makes consistency achievable is the same thing that makes any other skill consistent: sufficient repetition in low-stakes conditions, that the skills are practiced and somewhat automated before high-stakes conditions demand them. The composure practices applied in ordinary daily interactions in the mildly frustrating situations, the minor conflicts, the small pressures of ordinary days are not wasted on situations that don't matter. They are building the automated pathways that will be available at reduced deliberate cost when the genuinely demanding situations arrive. The ordinary days are the training. The demanding days are where the training is used. Part V. The composed mindset. Parts 1 through 4 have built the architecture of composure practice, the understanding of why composure fails, the specific tools for managing individual trigger events, the application of those tools in conflict and sustained pressure, and the longer practices of recovery and resilience training. Part 5 addresses the deepest layer, the identity transformation, through which composure stops being something you practice and becomes something you are. This is not an alternative to the preceding practices. It is their destination. Chapter 9. Confidence in your emotional control. Confidence grows from stability. Emotional confidence specifically in your capacity to manage your own emotional responses, is not a disposition that some people are born with and others are not. It is the product of accumulated evidence. Evidence of having encountered the kinds of situations that previously produced reactive responses and having managed them differently. Evidence of the mileposts having changed the outcome of moments that previously went sideways. Evidence of the recovery practices having restored balance after activation rather than the activated state persisting for days. Evidence built event by event across the ordinary experiences of daily life that the regulatory system can be relied upon. This evidence is different from intellectual conviction, knowing, conceptually, that composure is trainable and that the practices described in this audiobook work is not the same as having the felt, experiential knowledge that comes from having actually applied them in real moments and observed the different outcomes they produced. The conceptual knowledge is the starting point. The experiential knowledge is what builds confidence. Trusting your reactions is the specific form of emotional confidence that the composure practice eventually produces, the ability to trust that what you feel accurately reflects the situation, that the response you produce after the pause represents your genuine assessment rather than the reactive impulse, that your emotional system is a reliable instrument rather than an untrustworthy one that must be continuously managed with suspicion. This trust develops as the emotional system becomes more regulated, as the reactive patterns that produce disproportionate responses are gradually replaced by the calibrated responses that the practiced system produces. The person who has spent significant time in reactive behavior often has a specific relationship with their own emotional responses. Distrust. They have seen their emotions produce responses that turned out to be wrong, overblown, damaging. They have learned, reasonably, to be wary of acting on their first feelings. The distrust is the intelligent response to an unreliable system. As the system becomes more reliable, as the practices build a regulatory layer that produces calibrated rather than disproportionate responses, the basis for the distrust erodes. The feelings that arise after consistent composure training are more often proportionate to what produced them, more often accurate signals about what the situation actually contains, more often worth attending to rather than immediately managing or overriding. The emotional system that has been trained is a better instrument than the reactive one, and a better instrument can be trusted more fully. Emotional maturity is the quality that the trained emotional system expresses, not the suppression of emotional experience, not the absence of strong feeling, but the specific capacity to have the full range of emotional experience and to relate to it as information rather than as instruction. The emotionally mature person feels as fully as anyone else. They experience frustration, fear, excitement, grief, anger, joy, the full human spectrum. What is different is the relationship between the feeling and the behavior. The feeling is real, it is acknowledged, it is attended to, and it is not the only factor in what happens next. The deliberate mind participates in the translation from emotional experience to behavioral response, and the result is a response that reflects both the emotional input and the considered judgment of what the situation actually requires. This is maturity not in the sense of age or seniority, but in the developmental sense, the integration of the emotional and deliberate systems into a functional whole, where each contributes to the quality of the response and neither operates without the other's involvement. Self-respect through control is the specific form of esteem that the composure practice produces, and it deserves articulation because it is different in character from the self-esteem that is often discussed in relation to personal development. Self-esteem, as conventionally discussed, is often treated as something to be built through positive self-correction, through the recognition of one's own value and worth, through the affirmations and self-compassion practices that modify the internal narrative. These practices have genuine value in specific contexts. Self-respect through control is different. It is not produced by changing how you think about yourself. It is produced by the evidence of what you actually do, the consistent demonstration to yourself across the varied conditions of daily life that you can manage your own emotional responses in the ways that align with your values and your standards for your own behavior. The person who has, across months of consistent practice, genuinely built the capacity to pause before reacting, to maintain composure in the conflicts that previously escalated, to recover effectively after activation rather than stewing in activated states, this person has earned a specific kind of self-respect that is not available through any form of positive self-correction alone. It is earned through behavior, through the accumulated evidence of having done the difficult thing consistently. That earned respect is stable in a way that manufactured self-esteem is not. It does not require continuous maintenance through renewed affirmation. It is grounded, in fact, in the record of what you have actually done. And that grounding is what makes it a genuine support for the continued practice rather than a substitute for it. Chapter 10. The Habit of Composure. Composure becomes automatic. This is the destination that every preceding chapter has been building toward. Not composure as a practice applied with effort in difficult moments. Composure as the default mode, the way the system naturally operates when functioning well. Available without effortful initiation, expressed without conscious deployment. The transition from practice to automatic is the transition through which all skills develop when they are practiced consistently and long enough. The skill that initially requires deliberate initiation and effortful execution that draws on conscious attention and deliberate processing to apply eventually, through sufficient repetition, becomes produralized. It begins to run with less deliberate processing overhead. The initiation becomes less effortful. The execution becomes more fluent. The result more reliably matches the skilled output without the stumbling quality of early practice. For composure, this transition is real, and it has a specific subjective quality. The situations that previously required conscious effort to manage start to feel less demanding. The pause is taken before the thought to take it has fully formed. The recovery begins without the deliberate initiation that early practice required. The activation occurs, and the regulated response follows with less gap than it previously did between the activation and the composed reply. This is not the disappearance of the work. It is the work having been sufficiently done that it runs at lower conscious cost. Repetition and conditioning are the specific mechanisms through which this automatization occurs, and understanding them makes the practice more deliberate. Every time the composure practices are applied, every milepause taken, Every early recognition that caught an escalation before the window closed. Every recovery practice that returned the baseline to the regulated state. Two things happen simultaneously. The immediate outcome is changed. The specific moment goes differently than it would have without the practice. And the neural pathway that the practice runs on is slightly strengthened. The pattern of trigger recognition, pause, deliberate response becomes marginally more automatic, marginally more available, marginally less expensive. These marginal changes are invisible in any single instance. They are real across hundreds of instances. The pathway that runs with full deliberate cost in early practice runs with significantly reduced deliberate cost after consistent application across months. The response that required conscious effort to produce becomes the natural response, the one that the system produces by default. This is what conditioning means in the context of composure: the gradual, cumulative strengthening of specific patterns through consistent repetition until those patterns become the default expression of the system rather than deliberate departures from it. The identity shift is the deepest layer of the transition from practiced composure to inhabited composure, and it follows the same evidence-based process described in Chapter 9. The identity of a reactive person, the self-concept organized around the acknowledgement that strong feelings produce corresponding strong reactions, that certain types of triggers reliably produce losses of composure, that the emotional system is somewhat beyond deliberate management, was built from behavioral evidence, from the accumulated experience of having been reactive in specific kinds of situations over a long enough period that the pattern became a felt fact about the self. The identity of a composed person is built the same way from behavioral evidence, from the accumulated experience of having applied the practices, having changed the outcomes of the situations that previously went badly, having maintained composure in the conflicts that previously escalated, having recovered effectively from the captivations that previously extended into days of lowered threshold. Each instance is a piece of evidence. The accumulation over sufficient time and consistency shifts the self-concept. This shift is not an act of will. You cannot decide to have a different identity. What you can decide is to produce the behavioral evidence from which the identity follows. And every instance of the composure practice, however imperfect, however small, however briefly sustained before the old pattern reasserted itself, is a contribution to that evidence. The identity shift does not require perfect execution. It requires consistent direction, more often composed than not, across the varied conditions of ordinary life, over enough time that the pattern is genuinely descriptive rather than aspirational. When the pattern is genuinely descriptive, when composed response is what you actually do most of the time rather than what you intend to do, the identity follows the behavior rather than preceding it. Calm as your default state is what this looks like when it has been built, not the permanent, undisturbed equanimity of someone who has been sheltered from all difficulty, but the genuine baseline regulation of a system that has been trained to return to composure reliably, that meets difficulty from a position of available capacity rather than accumulated depletion, and that expresses, through the ordinary quality of its responses in the ordinary moments of daily life, the consistent result of the consistent practice. The state is not a permanent achievement. It is a maintained practice. The daily habits that sustain the regulated baseline, the recovery practices that prevent the gradual accumulation of depletion, The continued application of the composure tools in the situations that test them, these are not graduated from when the state is reached. They are what maintain it. The person who has built composure as a default maintains it through exactly the practices that built it, now with the efficiency that comes from automatization, but not without continued practice. Composure is not a destination. It is a direction. You have learned to walk in it. Keep walking. Closing. You don't need to eliminate emotion. You only need to stop being ruled by it. Every chapter of this audiobook has been working toward this sentence. Not the elimination of emotional experience, not the numbing or the withdrawal or the performance of a composure that is built over a turbulent interior rather than from genuine internal regulation. Not the impossible standard of never being activated, never being moved, never experiencing the strong states that are the natural response of a functioning emotional system to the significant events of a human life. The only thing this audiobook has been building toward is the space between what you feel and what you do, the gap in which genuine choice lies, the pause and what becomes possible inside it. Part 1 established the mechanism that reactive behavior follows patterns, that those patterns are built from emotional memory and trigger associations, and that composure collapses not only in dramatic moments but gradually, through the accumulated depletion that unchecked stress and emotional fatigue produce. Understanding the mechanism changed the diagnosis from a character trait you either have or lack, to a trainable capacity that can be built through specific practices applied to specific challenges. Part 2 built the foundational tools, the early recognition that catches escalation before the window for intervention has closed, and the myropause technique that is the direct behavioral expression of the composed response, the delay, the breath reset, the guiding question that restores enough deliberate access to change the outcome of the moment. Part 3 applied those tools to the real conditions that test them most directly: conflict, where the other person's activation creates specific pressure toward reciprocal escalation, and sustained stress, where the continuous demand of high workload periods creates the specific cognitive and emotional depletion that impairs composure even without any dramatic single trigger. Part 4 built the longer arc recovery as a skill, not a passive waiting for activation to pass, but the deliberate navigation back to the regulated baseline through specific practices, allowing the arc to complete, interrupting the cognitive loop that sustains activation, applying the physical and attentional tools that accelerate return, and resilience as progressive training, the deliberate engagement with manageable difficulty that builds the capacity for composed response in increasingly demanding conditions. And Part 5 arrived at the destination, the identity of the composed person, built from behavioral evidence, expressed in the genuine confidence that an increasingly reliable regulatory system produces, and sustained through the daily practice that maintains the default state rather than allowing the gradual erosion that neglect of the practices produces. Something specific has changed in you across the course of this audiobook. Not the change that only comes from doing that will require the practice described in the chapters you have just heard, but the change that comes from understanding the shift in how you see the moments of reactive behavior, in yourself and in others. Those moments are no longer evidence of character flaws. They are evidence of training gaps, specific, addressable places where the composure architecture is not yet built to the level the situation required. This reframe is not comfort. It is precision. Comfort lets you feel better about the problem while leaving it in place. Precision gives you the accurate diagnosis that makes the solution possible. The solution is not dramatic. It is not the transformation of a difficult week or a single intense effort. It is the consistent application across the ordinary days that make up a life of the practices described in the preceding chapters. Early recognition and the mildly frustrating interactions. The micropause in the exchanges that feel like they're beginning to escalate. Recovery practices after the captivations rather than letting them linger. Progressive, patient expansion of the capacity for composed response through deliberate engagement with manageable difficulty. And the daily habits that maintain the regulated baseline so that the capacity for composure is actually available when the situations that test it arrive. The person you are building is recognizable to the people who encounter them. Not because they announce their composure. The genuine article does not require announcement. Because the quality of their responses in the moments that others find difficult communicates something that performed composure never quite achieves. The naturalness, the absence of visible effort. The sense that the stability is structural rather than situational. That quality is earned. It is earned in the ordinary moments that this audiobook has been describing throughout. It is earned in the thousands of small applications of the pause, in the consistent recovery from the activations, in the daily maintenance of the regulated baseline. It is earned in the gap between feeling and action, held open through practice again and again until holding it becomes the default. You don't need to eliminate emotion. You only need to stop being ruled by it. That skill is now yours to build.